How did Christianity begin? It's a simple question, right? The Christian answer is obviously that Jesus miraculously rose from the dead. If you're a skeptic, you're obviously going to have to look for some sort of non-miraculous explanation. One explanation that has become increasingly popular is that Christianity began out of the disciples' own cognitive dissonance.
A simple cognitive dissonance.
Now, before we dive in, what the heck is cognitive dissonance anyway? Cognitive dissonance theory is a psychological theory that explains the discomfort that people feel when they hold two conflicting beliefs or values at the same time. When one is confronted with outside information that conflicts with their existing beliefs, they can either modify their beliefs or find a way to justify their current beliefs and reduce the dissonance. An individual or group is more likely to double down on a belief if it is significant to their identity. This enables them to defend their beliefs against dissonance or reduce dissonance without entirely giving up their beliefs. CDT was developed by social psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s while he was studying some rather strange doomsday cults.
Dawn is nigh, Zorp the surveyor approaches.
Prime example of cognitive dissonance in action is a religious group known as the Millerites. The Millerites were a revivalist group in the mid-19th century who followed the teachings of William Miller, a Baptist preacher who believed that Jesus Christ would return on a specific date in 1844. Miller's prediction was based on some terrible hermeneutics, and sadly, many of his followers sold their possessions and prepared for the second coming of Christ. However, when the predicted date passed and Christ did not come back as expected, the event became known as the Great Disappointment. While many of Miller's followers understandably abandoned ship, many of the Millerites hung around and experienced a state of cognitive dissonance. To reduce dissonance, the prediction was reinterpreted as the doctrine of investigative judgment. According to this belief, instead of Christ returning as Miller predicted, Jesus instead started this special period of judgment in 1844, and it continues to this day. If you're thinking to yourself, well, that's weird, I've definitely never heard of this before, it's because only Seventh-day Adventists are the ones who hold to this doctrine. Adventists believe that this judgment is taking place in heaven and will be completed before Jesus Christ returns to earth. So the question is this: if the Millerites did something like this, then why couldn't this be something that also happened in the early stages of the church? CDT theorists like to argue that, like the Millerites, Christians held on to their belief in spite of no non-real-world fulfillment of any messianic promises. Christians often hear objections like this from Jewish believers. For example, Rabbi Tovia Singer argues, if Jesus were the Messiah, you would know it from reading the newspaper, because the front page, instead of being about wars, would be about peace. But since Jesus' time until today, more than 120 million people have died in wars. The wolf is yet to lay down with the lamb. Predictions like this are often regulated out into the future, while Christians maintain that Jesus reigns over a spiritual kingdom. For the skeptic, this is all far too convenient, and CDT explains this very odd anomaly.
Well, isn't that convenient?
While this view has become increasingly popular in our time, it was something that was already being considered by an Anglican bishop in the 19th century by the name of JB Sumner. Sumner wrote, "But is it not possible that the followers of Jesus, being disappointed by his death and required to give an account for it, or to give up their purpose and confess themselves deluded, should have struck out the idea of the atonement and affirmed that he died as a sacrifice? Then, having hit upon his explanation, they supported it as they could out of the institutions of their law and the facts related to their history." In this video, I'm going to summarize Sumner's argument against the idea that the earliest Christians reinterpreted their religion and Jesus' apparent defeat in the light of Judaism. Sumner's book is in public domain, so you can actually get a copy of the book for free. I will give you a link in the description where you can go ahead and download it. Sumner gives many parallels between the life and death of Jesus and accounts from Jewish history. When we think of God the Son laying down his life, we might be prompted to think of the story of Abraham and Isaac. The cross and its promise of salvation might remind us of the story of the serpents in the wilderness. Jesus' death might bring to mind the sacrificial lamb of Passover. Additionally, Jesus is said to be an intercessor on our behalf, which resembles the role of Jewish priest. The spilling of Christ's blood reminds us of the significance of the blood of the atonement in Judaism. With all of these parallels, it seems perfectly reasonable to say that the first Christians would have been all too willing to invent their religion in accord with their prior religion after the death of their leader. They certainly had the emotional motivation to avoid the belief that Jesus had really been defeated and killed, and their pre-existing religion gave them a way to say that their leader was victorious after all. But not so fast.
Hold up.
Sumner gives us a few reasons why the parallels between Christ and Jewish history should not lead us to think that the first Christians invented Christianity based on their Jewish beliefs. The first reason has to do with the nature of the Mosaic Law and how the Jewish people viewed it. The Jewish people took this law to be wholly complete. By Christianity's own accounts, Jesus' audience never quite understood what he meant when he said that he came to fulfill the law. If they thought that the law was flawless, it's unlikely that a Jewish person would have concluded that Jesus made the law better if they are trying to be consistent within their own pre-existing beliefs. Also, Hebrews chapter 7 through 10 gives a clear example of an early Christian spelling out the parallels between Christ and Jewish history. There is no indication that the author assumes that Jews would readily conclude that this is all a natural extension and completion of Judaism. Rather, the author writes to persuade the Jewish audience that Christianity has significant parallels with Judaism. This suggests that the first Christians were met with skepticism from Jewish people, and a Jewish group of people would have been very unlikely to simply make up their religion based on their pre-existing beliefs. But what about the portions of the Old Testament that seemingly predict the Messiah? Couldn't a group of Jewish people have looked back into those messianic prophecies and then confirm to themselves that their Messiah hadn't really been defeated? It's possible, but this also assumes that Jesus matched what the prophecies predicted. It could just be by chance that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and that his coming should be announced by a forerunner, or that he should have come around the 490 years that Daniel predicted, or that he should have had the particular character that he had, and that he should die in a certain fashion. But it is extremely unlikely that Jesus would fit all of these characteristics by chance, and it is even more unlikely that he should fit them by chance and his followers would invent a religion that contrasts with their former religion after his death on a cross. When we weigh theories against each other, we want the theory that naturally fits all of the data. That Christianity is true explains why Christianity started, why it spread, and why it's still with us today. That Christianity is a result of grieving Jewish Christians looking back into their Jewish beliefs and scriptures and trying to find victory out of defeat for Jesus is contrary to what we know about first century Judaism of that time. It also does not explain why Christianity spread to Judea and the rest of the world. Furthermore, the Gospels indicate that the disciples already believed that Jesus was the Messiah prior to his death. This was not merely the result of his resurrection, but why did they think that before he died? The Gospels seem to indicate that it was in no small part because of his doing miracles. In the Gospels, the disciples were not just sucked into a mesmerizing personality and committed to him without further evidence. More significantly, the disciples attested to a highly specific empirical set of claims about which they could not easily be mistaken. They did so in a context where they could expect intense persecution or even death for doing so. Cognitive dissonance theorists have no parallels for this. The attempted parallels, such as ad hoc changes to the day when Jesus will come again after a failed prediction, are simply not even close to what happened in the case of Jesus' disciples. Finally, one striking coincidence is the fact that Christianity has become so widespread. Up until 313 AD, the Christian church was a persecuted minority. Powerful rulers and officials attempt to wipe it out, destroy its scriptures and its people. At various times, being a Christian could mean being crucified, thrown to the lions, or burned to death. The probability that Christianity would become a dominant global religion was vanishingly small. However, this is exactly what was predicted in various passages throughout the Old Testament, namely that the Messiah would bring representatives of all nations to a realization and worship of the God of Israel. For example, consider Isaiah 49:6-7, which reads, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation, the servant of rulers. Kings shall see and arise, princes, and they shall prostrate themselves, because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you." Jesus himself also made this prediction, specifying that this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. It's interesting that skeptics focus so much on Jesus supposedly discussing the end of the world in Matthew 24:34. This is because they have a very dogmatic way of thinking how that verse must be interpreted. It does seem to me to be a little bit of cherry picking when they focus on Matthew 24:34, but they ignore this particular passage or the parables that Jesus talks about where he tells them to anticipate some sort of long delay. This would be the parable of the talents or the parable of the 10 virgins. Jesus also said that the expansion of his kingdom would be worldwide and slow and steady, like that of a mustard seed growing into a large plant. Finally, the prophet Zechariah seems to predict two comings of the Messiah, one with him coming peacefully on a donkey, and another with him coming as a warrior and splitting the Mount of Olives. So, Which one is it? Some Jews have read these passages and other similar passages and concluded that there will be two Messiahs. The Messiah ben Joseph will be a suffering figure who will be killed in a battle and pave the way for the coming of Messiah ben David, who will be a victorious and triumphant king. Others have said that the Messiah can arrive in two different ways depending on the spiritual state that he finds Israel in. The teaching of Jesus found in the Gospels easily makes sense of both pictures. The messianic expectations in Judaism around the time of Jesus and afterward are very diverse and complex. Many people expected key prophecies to be fulfilled externally through earthly conquest and triumph, but it was also apparent that the messianic prophecies pointed to something far more mysterious, something eternal and divine. The Essenes community anticipated a heavenly Messiah who would bring forth a heavenly kingdom. There's so much more that could be said here that could expand on all of these points. The bottom line is that I don't think cognitive dissonance theory has things sewed up so neat and tidy as the theorists like to think. While I do think that it has some explanatory power compared to other skeptical hypotheses, I don't think it does a good enough job of explaining the majority of the data, which is why I don't think that people should accept it. It also relies on a lot of underlying literary theories about the Gospels that I think are open to serious challenge, and I think that's where the debate ultimately should lie. The one thing that I will say about this theory is I'm surprised at how little response there is to it. For me to have to go and find a book in the 19th century of an Anglican cleric responding to this particular theory tells me that this has been an all too neglected area in Christian apologetics. I know that I have probably only begun to scratch the surface, and there's so much more that could be said here. What are your thoughts on the theory? Leave a comment down below and tell me what you think.